Hi, so welcome to Unit 5. Sorry about posting this a bit late. I wanted to take the time to do this leisurely, and it was a rushed day today, so I thought I'd wait a little bit. No great rush with this unit in any event. It's a fairly leisurely unit. There's a lot of self-standing topics in this course. This is one of the self-standing topics. I recommend taking the time to watch this video and browse through the PowerPoint and to watch some of the trailers, possibly if time allows, to watch a couple of the movies. But I understand it's a 6 week course. You're very rushed. It may be that you shelve some of this and you give yourself a little list and come back to it later in the summer. That is entirely worth it. We're looking at outcomes beyond the 6 weeks and really to build your overall sort of perspective on critical pedagogy. So a lot of these may be worth coming back to at a later stage. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to spend quite a bit of emphasis on Teach Us All, because if there's really one film that I recommend you see, is that one, and I'll explain to you in a minute how to access it. But more widely, we're going to look at representation of critical pedagogy in pop culture, and in more detail than this, the complex relationship between critical pedagogy and pop culture, particularly film. And then also within that, examine the representation of marginalized students' voices in pop culture as well, and consider the wider overlaps and connection between pop culture and critical pedagogy. So let's pass this, but come to Giroux's. So as you know, Giroux is kind of the Ferré successor in terms of leading voice in critical pedagogy. So I wanted to start with one of his quotes. As a form of public pedagogy, film combines entertainment and politics and, as I've attempted to argue, lays claim to public memory, though it in contested ways given existent, distinct, varied, and social cultural transformations. So Giroux is one of you heard texts by him. There's only 2 readings this week, although if you look, you will find more readings, certainly, that connect popular culture and particularly film and critical pedagogy. But he's one of the writers that has thought a lot about that connection and formalized some of that reflection in texts and studies, etc. So there are 4 dimensions really to that relationship between critical pedagogy and pop culture, and pop culture generally. But we will see that film certainly is monumentally important in this unit. So first of all, popular culture and Hollywood more specifically is fascinated by the issue of, and the concerns of critical pedagogy. So you'll see that it's present in quite a lot of films and TV shows. Now, vice versa, critical pedagogues wish to share their ideas and their research with the public in a way that aligns with critical pedagogy. So they're going to be very skeptical and critical of formal vehicles such as journals, arguing that reflection on critical pedagogy that's articulated in academic journals doesn't reach the people it needs to reach. So leading that reflection further, its normal and logical conclusion is that if you don't want to limit your reflection on critical pedagogy to just academics and you want to reach the general public, you need popular culture to be a vehicle towards the general public. And film is seen as that, more democratic, non-institutional, free, hierarchical power dynamics. So there's a lot of critical pedagogy that gets showcased in film. Now, another dimension of this relationship is that many critical pedagogues use film and public culture to reach their students in class in a dialogical way. Teachers use film as it speaks to students better than text. So when we look back at that effort of conscientization, well, conscientization is going to be probably easier to achieve in class through debates articulated around films than they will be in debates articulated around the written text. Of course, there's exception to that, but if we look at an overall rate of success with students who may be highly marginalized and feeling already disgruntled with biformal banking education, film is probably going to be much closer in creating connection to the students' lived experience. And lastly, critical pedagogues are concerned with giving the students a voice, and in many cases, film becomes the vehicle for that voice. So we're going to see that in some of these examples. It could be that they showcase student voice being at the center of the narrative. So that's a sort of modeling. And then beyond that, we will look at a lot of films and documentaries that have students at the center. So as you see, it's a rich reflection. If we had a much longer course, it would be really, really interesting to spend a couple of weeks on this, because I think students often find it highly rewarding. It is almost impossible, in my opinion, to really consider critical pedagogy academically without considering it in popular culture. So even if you don't have time during this unit, I really encourage that you continue this reflection in a simple way, that you will continue going to movies and to watch TV and think, oh, okay, I can definitely see a connection here. Either in the sense that you're seeing the message of critical pedagogy being showcased, or that you are seeing critical pedagogues in documentary, for example, using film to raise specific issues around social justice. Or sometimes, again, it will be students that are at the center of some of the popular culture that you see. In all those cases, you will remember this course and you'll probably go back to your notes. Okay, so now let's go back to the first one, which I jumped. So this one, I wanted to give it a little bit more consideration. I would say this is the perfect example of the sort of film, it's a documentary, that can be used for the act of conscientization in class. We started that discussion around how, as a teacher, as a member of the hegemonic group, how can I support marginalized students in getting to that level of conscientization? So becoming aware of their marginalization, becoming aware of how unsatisfactory the banking model is in their growth and development. I think a film like this is a perfect example of what you might be able to use in the classroom. So it's made for the general public, but it definitely would have a very useful role at the center of the critical pedagogy classroom, in whichever format you consider it. So I'll let you watch it. I think what we've got to realize is it's the reason why it's so perfect as a tool for critical pedagogy is that it's a documentary. It uses layperson terms. It's easy to watch. Certainly, this with even high school students, and it does that postmodern work. Right, we've seen critical pedagogy brings together postmodern thought and critical theory. Here, it's the postmodern thought. So it's going to unpack and dissect your traditional idea of desegregation and show you that in fact reality isn't at all what you think it is. So it could be that perfect trigger for students to really have a deep reflection around race in school. So what I've done is you have I don't know if you do know, but we have an agreement between UPI and a streaming service called Canopy, Kanopy. It used to be that UPI students and faculty could watch whatever they wanted in Canopy, but the fees, the cost has gone up. So you don't have free access to everything in the catalog, but we can, at request for certain courses, that you have access to specific film. That's what I've done for this one. So you will have free access through Canopy by signing in with your UPI login. So I will load up the link that the library has sent me. I really recommend that you watch this one, if not in this unit, at least before the end of the course, because I think it is really, really going to give you to really trigger a rich reflection. First, because the themes are important, so at surface level, but also when you reflect as an educator, how could I use this to do some of the work that we've been discussing in this course? Very interesting film, really, really at the center of what we do. So centerpiece here, if you are, we're going to sort of prioritize this. The rest will be more background, illustration, some of it very historical, and some of it less so. So some of the films that are generally connected, and this is a loose connection here. The first one is Fame. You've probably seen the remake, but here I'm talking about the original, which is quite old now. Hasn't aged super well, but if you manage to catch it for free on YouTube or something with Vimeo, it is quite funny to watch and to dissect, because it really is actually a very candid, perhaps naive vision of definitely a critical pedagogy sort of message. It's a performing art school. It's actually based on a real school, which is based in Brooklyn, I think, which still exists, which is basically a high school for performing arts. So it's an interesting concept, right? It's a high school where you go where performing arts are integrated into the curriculum. So the curriculum is changed to fit within performing arts. So you can see how that would be appealing anyway in terms of critical pedagogy. If you're big on films and you follow current sort of film news, etc. If you know Timothée Chalamet, who's the young man who played in Call Me by Your Name and was nominated for an Oscar in literally his first big role. He was nominated for a lead actor Oscar at 21, I think. He went to this, so it was in the news a lot because he talked about the power of that school and the power of this sort of innovative arts-based public education. But in the original film, which again is based on the school, you have basically almost a caricature of the young African American man, the young African American girl, the Italian immigrant kid, the Jewish kid, all of these these stereotypes of the American melting pot coming together and challenging a school which is still based on arts performance, but still very traditional and mostly based on the classical, stage arts, and challenging it in their dance performance, in their music interpretations, etc. And then the school itself becoming a platform for emancipation. So again, maybe a little naive, a little candid, but definitely a lot of critical pedagogy there. Another one that jumps up at people right away when you think about critical pedagogy is Dead Poet Society. So you've probably seen this one. There are scenes, particularly when, stand on your desk, I'm paraphrasing here, and then, and tear the pages of the book, etc. There's definitely specific passages in that book that have been written with critical pedagogy and with Freire in mind. There's absolutely no doubt about it in the script. Obviously, Dead Poet Society, we have to be a little critical. And some of these sources, they are related to critical pedagogy, but we have to be a little critical as well. It's based on a private school, so it does, although it adheres to some of the premise of critical pedagogy and some of the most important tenets, it bases it in an environment where we have to question the very notion. The oppression there really is kids being oppressed by a system that's going to turn them into bankers. It's not exactly the same sort of minority rights that we've been looking at. So it does create some issue. And obviously there's a very Hollywood dramatic because it has to go to the death of students and then the sacking of the teacher. There's a very Hollywoody twist on it, and we're going to look at perhaps what we need to seek when we explore the relationship critical pedagogy and pop culture, and particularly film. It's going to be a more authentic look, right? Not a Hollywoody varnish and and gloss on it. Pink Floyd's Another Brick in the Wall was, both an animation movie and an album. But if you look at the videos as well, so you've got a clip there to the original music video for, Tisha's Another Brick in the Wall. People my age, sung this on the way to school. It's quite interesting to watch it again, and you will see again that it's quite crude, but it's basically a lot of Freire, put in very early video format. And early music videos haven't aged terribly well, but you will see that's quite amusing that you've read all the text of Freire and stuff. I'm sure if you watch the video again, you are going to be amused by how almost literal it is in that video. History Boys is interesting. So if you've never seen the film, it's actually the adaptation to the screen of a play which was very, very popular in London and then moved to Broadway. That one is interesting because really it's the struggle. It's a comedy, but it's the struggle of a group of friends in a public working class school to try and get into Oxford. And there's lots of elements of comedy, but there's some moments of definitely of social justice sort of lens and critical pedagogy lens. So overall, it's an interesting, definitely fits within critical pedagogy in the sense that you have these kids very aware of what's against them, very aware of their need to change the power dynamics and to empower themselves, not just go to university, but empower themselves in a society and a professional and sort of educational world that doesn't favor them and is not going to work in their favor. The Matrix, we've already had a couple of a couple of clips on The Matrix. When we look at Sign, The Matrix is a really interesting film. And when you think back of the scene, it is a lot of critical pedagogy, which is in it. It's very literal. It's almost sort of woven into the script, because really when you have the choice of taking the two pills, do you take the pill and come up with the blue or the red and continue living as you do? Do you take the other and get awakening? It is literally that concept of conscientization taken from Freire and put into a film. There's a lot of interpretation of the Matrix in terms of social justice and in terms of racial theory, etc. So you're going to find, if you watch it again, I'm sure the first time I watch it as a sort of science fiction movie, but the first one is extremely smartly put together. And for people who are quick to wave this, that both directors have now come out as trans, and have spoken very, very eloquently about what it was for them passing and living in fear before they came out, etc. So this notion that the reality, this sort of hidden reality of which they talk that they refer to in the Matrix, something it's very, very personal to the directors, and it's interesting to watch. And you will see as a media piece where one of the two directors actually receives a prize and gives a long speech on trans identity and coming out as trans. And interesting to relook at Matrix with that story in mind, and to look at the themes of critical pedagogy being present. Polytechnique, I've spoken about this before. When we looked at gender, I think it's a really interesting film because it's almost done in a sort of historical, almost documentary fashion. It's very little said, very little judgment, which means it leaves you an awful lot of place to think about what is tragically wrong with the situation, and not just then, in Montreal and in higher education, but what remains wrong about gender. And it's very subtle. And again, there was a lot of fear when the film was made that it was going to be sensationalist, but it's really had wide sort of acknowledgments and celebrations for being very, very sensitive. And I think it's in black and white as well, and it says very little and lets the shock work, and it leads you to a reflection really around gender. You can't avoid it. So all of these are interesting in sort of in a related way. We saw that in a different dimension now. When in critical pedagogy, again, it's youth-driven, student-driven. So if we are trying to represent that in film and in media and popular culture, we're going to try and put the voice of youth at the center in the most authentic way that we can, right? If we're trying to actually tell the stories or make people understand what it's like to be marginalized and to be oppressed and to be stigmatized. And some films and series have done particularly well at developing what I call an ethnographic representation of marginalized youth, meaning that really the story is told from them, right, from their perspective. So Kids, if you've not seen Kids, it's a film I really recommend that you see. Very, very big in the 90s. It's sort of, people have had a very short memory on this one, but it was celebrated, hated, won lots of awards, but really it's exceptional in a sense that it's the first time that a Hollywood movie really placed the eye of the camera on the lives of youth, on teens. And it's a story about AIDS. It's based in New York, in working class districts, within schools. And it looks at kids' difficult relationship with sex, particularly in the times of AIDS. And it's something really that has rarely been done again with such authenticity, in, again, placing the camera inside the perspective of youth. So I really recommend that you have a look. There's a lot written about kids as well. La Haine is another film which is extremely powerful. We'll come back to this when there's a unit where I talk about equipping yourself with tools that allow you to do the work that we've discussed. And I'll give you some of my experiences having worked with certain tools in the classroom. La Haine is one I will bring back up in that sense. But here we're looking at it from the perspective, particularly of creating ethnographic representation of student voice. So it's a film. It's by a guy who's only really made one film, but it's not as if he's not well known. He's been an actor, he's done a lot of other things, but in terms of directing, that was really his only film. It's now probably, I think it was done in the 80s, so it's probably definitely 35 years old, if not 40. And it's filmed in black and white. It is hard, certainly, for non-French speakers to follow, even for French speakers, because a lot of it is in slang. So it's actually subtitled in a lot of versions, and it's all filmed within 24 hours in the life of three kids living in suburban Paris. And it is a complete masterpiece. It's a film that has gone through, I would say, generations without aging. And I've used this film on three different continents with very different students. And the love that the students have for this film has been the same throughout these 3 decades, regardless of whether they're French speakers or not French speakers. It really has a potential to mesmerize, particularly kids that have felt marginalized, and for them to identify with the story. If you've never seen it, watch it. For the anecdote, as a French person, having tried to get this film in Canada, it was banned from sales until about 2005. In what I would say would call mild censorship. There are lots of excuses why, copyright reasons why it wasn't sold. I don't think this is the reason why it wasn't sold. You'll see it's a highly sensitive film for lots of reasons that has aged very well. And you can watch it today in any sort of context, and it relates to a lot of what we see in the news in terms of how marginalized kids are often stuck in these systems that give them absolutely no hope. Ma Vie en Rose is an interesting film if you are interested in trans right. I realize now that my slides have somewhat aged because there's been a lot of interesting other trans films about trans youth that have been done. But Ma Vie en Rose is one of the original. I would say what makes Ma Vie en Rose really unique is that it's told from the perspective of a very, very young child, and it's done with a lot of candor, in a sense that you are seeing the whole story through her eyes, and you see how everything makes sense for her, and it's the adults that are having problems dealing with reality. So I really recommend it. It's in French, but if you find it on YouTube or on Vimeo, etc., I really recommend that you watch it if you find a way of streaming it not too expensive. There are other films that have been very recently that have been very popular as well. So the one that comes to mind I really should have put there, but you will find the trailer easily. It's on Netflix. It's called Girl. It's a very, very, very powerful movie. If you're interested at all in trans rights, watch that film. It's an absolute little masterpiece. And there's another one. I can't remember the title in French now, but I will add it as a note. It's another more recent film that I watched just last year, which is very good as well. Very light. Almost nothing happens, but it's definitely again told from the child perspective, with that sort of candor and naivety where they really don't understand what the big deal is, and it's the adults that are really creating dramatic situations around the trans identity. The original English Skins is a masterpiece too, of creating a style of public, popular culture. It's a TV series. I think there were 5 series in the UK. And it's extremely ethnocentric in the themes, in the candor with which the themes are discussed, in the vocabulary, in the level of language, in the perspective. It's really a story that has been appealing to the whole general public, but it really is written from the perspective of youth. And youth, and all sorts of really important issues that we've discussed in this course come up. Of course, there's the drugs and the sex and all this, but beneath that, a lot of the issues we've looked at around social justice and around student voice around social justice actually in the film, in the series. It's very important. It's one of these things that gets remade, so there's an American Skins. I don't recommend it. The English really is much better. Same thing for Queer as Folks. American Queer as Folks wasn't bad, but the original British Queer as Folks is excellent. And also, if you look at it historically, there's something really that was groundbreaking in discussing certain themes, and the tone itself was not just ethnocentric in terms of youth, but the desire of saying this is what change should be, and this is how it's going to be, and this is what having a voice and being LGBTQ2S plus means. And one of the main characters is 16 and at school, so it links directly to our themes around school and critical pedagogy and oppression in schools and finding your voice, etc. So again, if you've never watched it, I think it's on Crave. It's either on Crave or on Prime, but you can definitely watch it within Canada. Okay, here we go into some more, when we said that Hollywood is fascinated with critical pedagogy, or Hollywood and beyond, film industry generally. And so some films I recommend, if you have time to watch them, suddenly their critical pedagogy is at the center. In some of the cases, it's actually discussed really literally. You will see certain terminology, certain literally sentences that we use in class being present in the film. First one is a French film. It's not quite old. It's probably about 10 or more than that, 15 years now. Won the first Palme d'Or at Cannes. It's a unique film in the sense that it all happens in the classroom, and it was filmed with amateur actors, so with a totally new genre, almost sort of reality TV. But they were actors, but they were playing, and there's a beautiful candor and freshness to the acting. What's really interesting about Troy Murray, it's a story of a French high school teacher who works in a difficult suburb in Paris, as there are many, where socio-economic challenges mixed with huge cultural diversity, with huge issues with employment, issues around race and racism, etc. And basically, he tries his best. He tries to create a connection. He attempts something akin to transformative action and critical pedagogy. And what's interesting about this film is that he fails. And it's the story of in a year of his job and during the academic year, and time sort of fluctuates. It's always hard to see where we are, but basically the whole film is from September to June, and he fails miserably. And I think sometimes it's refreshing to have films like this that are not Hollywood sort of dramatic or happy ending, and actually more concerned about expressing the complexity of that sort of work. And I've used it in class a lot. I've watched it tons of time. I think it ages well. If it had been produced now, it really wouldn't change anything. It's the classroom format, etc. Allow when you watch it the fact that this is France, so the structure is much more rigid. So a lot of things will shock you, because even when he tries to do critical pedagogy, he tries in a format that is so rigid, and for us Canadian, it still feels like it's fairly regimented. But within that context, he's trying hard and suddenly setting himself at odds with his colleagues, etc. But he fails, and I think it's important that we have films about critical pedagogy that show you how difficult it can be. The one I would most recommend that you watch in terms of films that are sort of focused on critical pedagogy in terms of showcasing it is Half Nelson. It's a little jewel, that film. If you've never seen it, I watched it completely accidentally one day on streaming it. It's square into parameters of discourse with Ryan Gosling. He's absolutely amazing in this, but the young actors are amazing too. And again, there are bits in it when you will see yourself where he uses vocabulary in the classroom that's a direct reference to Freire and everything that we're discussing. He works, he's a white teacher who's a bit bohemian, trying to do his best, working in sort of a racially diverse, sort of mostly African-American school, trying to hit that transformative action and to have a purpose and do some of that empowerment. But he's also an anti-hero. He's not perfect. He has a bit of a drug issue. He's not quite, cohesive and clean. And that becomes sort of an interesting angle, because it sort of demolishes some of the danger of always positioning, the white folks as being leading this. So it really resets the power dynamics and shows really some of the complexity in that relationship too. And there's moments where he's literally challenged in the film by the students. as in, who are you to, to try and sort of and create, right, that awakening and that empowerment when you've got all your problems to solve. So I think there's something really interesting there. We could write a lot, and a lot has been written about Half Nelson. If you do watch one, I recommend you watch that one. I think it's going to complement your reflection well. And then we have Dear White People. There you have a choice. You can watch the original film, or you can watch the first series. The first series pretty much identical to the film, with a lot of the actors appearing in both. The second series hasn't hit me as evidently, um, you know, in terms of effectiveness and connection to critical pedagogy. But the first one, it's almost a transcription of the themes of our class into a campus environment with added humor. So that's interesting about Dear White People, is that it's both an almost complete paraphrasing of a course on critical pedagogy within an illustration of a film, but it also adds humor to sort of to erode some of the tension that you feel, probably because it's hard to discuss some of these topics, right? So there's that layer of humor which serves to oil the wheels and keep the film moving, and it's really interesting. Again, series one or the film itself. After that, it becomes a little harder to make direct connections to our course. Obviously, we talked about documentaries too. Lots of documentaries we've already seen. Born into Brothel, Teach Us All, you're going to probably watch. Most Likely to Succeed is an interesting film. I don't know if I leave it on that list, because there's some interesting bits in Most Likely to Succeed, but I think overall I would have to say it falls most within constructivism than in critical pedagogy. But there are little elements of critical pedagogy in it, in a sense that it's a film that tries to look at what students feel and want and design 21st century and the changes that they want in schooling. So I think in that sense it's still interesting. There's another film on Vimeo you'll find, Listen, which is an American, basically high school kid who takes a camera and decides to make a movie. And it's a quite interesting film to watch as well. Pretty good example of what critical pedagogy is, when a student finds their voice and uses a camera. Some new releases, OE4, it's a Casablanca Beats. I've shown you the trailer already and told you that it was making a lot of noise at the Cannes Festival. A couple of years back, there was another French film which came out called Les Grands Esprits. It's English, it's translated The Teacher. I watched this one on the plane. It's a comedy at first. I didn't really feel that interested in it, but it does get interesting. So in France, just to give you some context, in France, you don't apply for a school posting. You are posting of teachers into schools is a national centralized system. So you grow in ability to make choices with seniority in your career and with your performance review. But as you begin your career, you're often sent, in wherever you are needed, which is often, again, in those suburban, difficult school in socioeconomically challenged environments. Here we have the story of someone who's at the end of their career. So he is in a very, very good and even competitive, selective French public school, high school in the middle of Paris, one of the best schools in France. And he's at the end of his career. He's well connected. His father knows the Ministry of Education. And at one point he goes to a drinks party and he drinks too much. And he starts having a really impassioned discussion with not the minister itself, but I think the sub-minister for education. And then the next day, the film begins, and the next day, that sub-minister for education or deputy minister for education is taking him at his word, because he said when he was drunk, if I were to do something, I would go back into the suburban schools, this difficult school, and this is what I would do. These young teachers don't know what to do. So he is seconded for 1 year into, a racially diverse, working class suburban school outside Paris. And at first it's a little wobbly there. Mostly works on comedy, but then it actually gets quite interesting, because he tries critical pedagogy. He basically tries to create an awakening in these kids that they are being chewed up by the system, and that there's really nothing for them at the end of the road, and I really encourage them to challenge the system itself, and to draw something else out of it, and to make the system work for them. And again, it's interesting because at first he's hated by the system, so it's interesting to see into how institutions react to someone like that. So there's a lot of pushback from colleagues, etc. And then eventually he leaves at the end of his secondment, and a lot of things go wrong. So again, it's not a Hollywood varnish. It starts off as a comedy, but it actually touches on a lot of interesting sort of points of tension about what is it like when someone tries to challenge a system and actually create that sort of change. And it's not sort of rosy and sort of Hollywoody. Um, Other examples too. I found this example interesting. Some of you may have already watched it on YouTube. You have on Netflix. You have a series called Rita. It's from Denmark. And I find it really interesting because it doesn't start off as typical critical pedagogy, but here you have a teacher who is basically very sort of acts on guts, was herself anti-establishment, has reached that career where really, when we're going to talk a lot about at the end of the course of when are we confident enough to do critical pedagogy, when are we confident enough to challenge a system that when we have that tenure, that secure employment, it becomes a lot easier. And that's exactly what it is, right? She's reached that point in her career where she doesn't mind challenging people, challenging authority, challenging her supervisors and her principal. And again, works with guts and make lots of decisions where the system doesn't want her to make some decision, but she sort of said, whatever, I'll go with my instinct and I'll go with what I want the students to do. And it becomes very, very keen to critical pedagogy. But mostly I found what's interesting is that it's really a central narrative of a teacher who refuses to work within the system. And in that respect, it's interesting for us in that course. So if you get to watch it, I think you would probably enjoy it. And then something that finally, which is a little different, but sometimes there are films that are not connected with critical pedagogy that critical pedagogues manage to bring into their class to create, again, a sort of opportunity for conscientization. And here I'm going to spend a little bit of time on this because it's actually really interesting. I listened to this on CBC on the Q when I was still living at East. It was 2019, as you see there, and it was Halloween, so it was October 31st. I was driving back from Halifax, and I thought this was actually an incredible interview. So I think I managed to still find you the original interview. That's the last link. The other ones are various bits of news that have talked about the content of the interview, and basically it's a prof at UCLA who teaches a course on race, and she uses GetAt to talk and first of all build a course on race, on racial, so on African American horror and science fiction, and then builds a whole unit on the depiction of race in society, looked from the point of view of science fiction and African American horror. So I'll let you watch the interview, but I think it's really interesting, and this gives you a good example of. So we've seen films, etc., connected directly to critical pedagogy, but then we also have to look at people who bring in film, which might not be, or popular culture, which might not be critical pedagogy itself, but they bring it in for the purpose of conscientization, for the purpose of creating these spaces within their classroom to talk about, to create that awareness of power inequities, etc. So if you have time to immerse yourself in this, at least watch the interview and then maybe read one of the two pieces before you get into the interview. And I think you're going to find it really interesting. And I think it's a perfect example of some of what popular culture serves as a purpose within critical pedagogy for critical pedagogues that want to use popular culture in the classroom to do that sort of work. And we'll come back to that again while I'll give some of the examples of what I've used personally when I've tried some of that. And that is it. So I hope you enjoyed the sort of walkthrough. Try and watch at least some of the trailers. I think it's going to at least, sort of give you another depth beyond just my voiceover. If you have time, watch This Is Teach Us All, and I would say Half Nelson. And the rest probably keep in mind, and or maybe watch a girl. If I recommend a third one, I'd say watch Girl. Definitely, if you have time within the course, it'd be really fun to see some of your reaction, and it definitely fits perfectly in high school, etc. Okay, I'll let you go. Again, no specific tasks this week. I will open a thread just for you to post if there's, first of all, if there's other films or popular culture that you think we should raise within this unit. Secondly, if you get to watch any of this or you have watched any of this, if you want to write a piece that would be part of your participation grade, that would be fun for some of you if you're interested in this unit and in this and this sort of dimension perspective on our reflection. And otherwise, I will see you tomorrow for the collaborate session, and then on Friday, I think, for the next one. Okay, bye.